say, because I wrote quite a bit of music for the workshop, about a third of the piece, and I more or less kept it as it was. I didn't add too much, and then I just continued the composition. But the most fruitful things about the workshop was the chance to test those ideas in here to make sure that they worked, and to sort of refine things in my electronics, and also to avail myself of the recording session we did during the workshop in the autumn. So I had a lot more material for things to use in the electronics, and also things that I tested that I plan to write for the final piece. So it was a very useful opportunity to bring the sort of conceptual ideas I had when writing the piece to something tangible, something that I could listen to and then work with directly as I developed those ideas further.
James, do you want to play? Do you know where you want it? Or?
I don't quite, so it's maybe an experiment, but somewhere that will pick up a lot of the noise, the mechanical noise of the...
Around here?
There were certainly new sections of the work that I wrote, and so those involved the integration of new sounds and this connection with the sounds of various cities. There were some that I visited after the workshop, and I made new recordings, also new field recordings between the workshop and the final composition of the piece. So the sense in which the sort of global reach or integration of the piece was able to expand in that way.
22. Oui, attends, j'ai besoin de notes.
This work, I think, is the work that I have tried the most to integrate the acoustic sounds of a chamber ensemble with the sounds of something recognizable from the external world. I've looked at this idea a lot in various compositions, but in this piece I tried more to use live processing of the musicians to create a closer connection to the kind of timbres of the sounds of the field recordings that I had used in the electronics. So most recently, developing the piece with the musicians for the premiere, there were a lot of adjustments that I made in that aspect of the piece, in particular of the live processing. So just very precise tweaks of the equalization, of the even the algorithm of the transposition that I was using. I changed a few times between rehearsals, and it was this process of being able to really work over several days and try different methods to get the right mix of sound that I think allowed the piece to get to where it is now, which has come quite far even in just the last couple of weeks. This piece was relatively consistently planned from the beginning. I had a pretty clear idea of what I wanted it to be, and in a sense that was sort of a struggle during the composition. I like it when I kind of destroy my ideas, and I like to have the opportunity to really reflect on things and change and to completely rebuild what I've planned. So I was a bit nervous writing this piece that didn't happen, that it was so clear for me, and I found that as a struggle. At one point I had this idea and I was certain that it was going to completely change the piece, and I thought, this is the moment that usually happens where I completely wipe away everything and start over again. And that was, for this piece, I wanted to build this robotic sculpture of discarded saxophone parts and place it in the center of the hall And so it was going to be kind of this architecture of old saxophones and these robotic manipulations like fingers on the keys, and there would be tactile transducer speakers attached to this object, and so the sounds of the musicians would be diffused into this kind of saxophone cityscape. And I thought, okay, that's the real challenge that I'm going to give myself to let this piece kind of become something very different. And for lots of reasons, that didn't pan out, and I didn't do that for this piece, or at least for this version of it. And I'm quite content with the way it turned out, but having that idea in the middle of the creative process and then having to discard it was interesting in the way that it made me think about the rest of the material I composed. So maybe in a future version of the piece I will add that, or maybe I'll make a separate installation that exists on its own with this idea, but we'll see. It's really interesting, this question of space over this project, of having worked with the musicians, because we did this workshop in this same concert hall, and I developed a lot of my ideas in particular for this space, even knowing that the piece perhaps would eventually be played elsewhere. There was this kind of interesting trajectory of having a lot about how I wrote the piece be defined by this space. For example, it's a very reverberant space. There's a wooden stage. There are some parts where the musicians stomp with their feet, and the particular kind of diffusion of the contact microphones on their instruments works very well in this space. And so it was nice to have the workshop to kind of try those ideas. But then composing other parts of the piece where I wasn't in that space, when I was at my home, working in a studio, and then rehearsing also with the quartet before we got back into this space, the piece felt very far from what I wanted it to be. So there was finally coming back to the piece's home, if you like, the site of the premiere, allowed things to click. The piece is called In Specific Cities, and it's kind of this web of connections between the idea of cities, specificity, citation, in situ, site-specific. There are all these kind of words that are rolling around, and I think it's really about individual and collective experiences of living in cities, and also individual and collective experiences of performing music, of listening to music, and trying to make a connection between those two things. So the interpretation and listening of music, as well as the sort of experience of performing life and listening to life as if one lives in a city, for example. And so there's this sense of embodiment that I'm interested in the performativity of the sort of the human qualities of the musicians, the way that they use their body, their breath, their feet, in this case, as a way of imitating or capturing sounds of the external world. So there are things that we feel quite separate from, perhaps, or maybe not, when we're out in the street and we hear the sound of an engine brake or something like that, an exhaust pipe from a big truck, and trying to connect to that with something that we can make with our own breath, and in this case also with an instrument, but something that's very connected to the kind of physical experience of performing was something I wanted to do in this piece to kind of capture the very individual experience, the sort of sense of being an individual in a very public space. I think it's entirely up to an individual listener to what extent they will connect to these kinds of ideas of this sense of embodiment, if they will reflect personally on the way that they are embodied in their environment. These are just the ideas that I was thinking of when I wrote the piece, and the way that I was guided in how I interacted with the musicians and the sounds that I recorded. And after that, I think it's more interesting that the listeners should respond to it in completely different ways, perhaps, but it's always difficult to sort of establish a kind of one-to-one relationship between what one is thinking about when one tries to communicate anything in any manner and what's on the other end of that. So I'm more interested in the mess, you might say.